Good evening, I'm Janet Blake. I'm the Curator of Historical Art at Laguna Art Museum. I'm the co-curator of this exhibition with Dr. Deborah Salon. So she's going to do a presentation tonight. As those of you who may already have our book or have read her essay, you know that she focused on the critical reception of the artists in the art colony, in the Art Association, from the teens up until about the late 1930s. I've known Deb for more than 25 years, and she did a show here in 1999 called Colonies of American Impressionism, which included Laguna Beach as well as Coscob, Shinnecock, and Old Lyme in the East Coast. And that's when I first worked with Deb. She did several other shows with Laguna Art Museum, including In and Out of California, Travels of American Impressionists, which was in 2003. She did a show on the artist Colin Campbell Cooper in 2006 and 7 that traveled to Long Island. Deb went to Vassar. She grew up in Queens, New York, went to Vassar, and she received a PhD from the City University of New York, and her PhD was on the California artist Alson Clark. And that exhibition was at the Pasadena Museum of California Art. So I knew when we decided that we were going to do a Centennial exhibition and celebrate the Art Association and the history of the colony and the early years, that the perfect person to do this with me was Deb. You will find that she's an absolutely wonderful lecturer. She today works as a professor of art history at various schools in the area. She's even taught classes recently in which our former board president was studying, Robert Hayden. So that was fun that she was his professor. I think you'll enjoy her lecture very much, and so now, Deborah Salon.
Thank you, Janet. It's a pleasure to be here. Welcome to you all. Over the years, people have often asked me, how do you put together a museum show? How do you actually formulate a concept? Which objects do you choose? And I always say that putting together an exhibition is like experimenting with a new cake recipe. You generally know the ingredients, but you're not quite certain if a pinch too much of this or one thing or another will actually ruin the finished product. And so the answer is, really, there is no formulaic answer to putting together a show. And every exhibition you do is different. And if you have several curators collaborating on a project, how do you actually define the boundaries of what each will cover so there's no or very, very little overlap? So our mandate, Janet and I, when we fleshed out this exhibition in its very embryonic stages, was to cover the LBAA from its inception, 1918, through 1935. So that sort of narrowed the scope, I would say, but it still left us with a lot of ground to cover. And we decided that, in general, Janet would explore the history of the organization. So the question was going to be, what was I going to do? And I can tell you that the essay that I wrote was not the essay that I had originally conceived. Ultimately, I decided to do several things. One was to see how the LBAA fit into the context of this new development of what we called art associations, because really that was something new. To see what the critical reaction was going to be to the shows at the LBAA, and to see how the Art Association fit into the context of the fast-growing town of Laguna Beach, which pretty much had gone from a very sleepy hamlet at the turn of the century to a very important art center, which had at its nucleus the LBAA. The LBAA was not founded as a museum, although eventually it was chartered as a museum. It was a for-profit organization organized by artists to help create a venue in which they could sell their work. Artists began to gather in Laguna Beach years before the Art Association was formed. Laguna, with its beautiful coastline and its hills, offered perfect vistas for painters, and you're looking at here a Lucia camp looking towards the ocean very, very on in the early part of the century. And even in the early days of the colony, getting to Laguna was possible once the railway was established at El Toro and a stagecoach was utilized to drive through the canyons. Eventually, vehicular traffic became ubiquitous once adequate roads were built. Very few artists lived in Laguna full-time during the first decade of the 20th century, but several built studios, and eventually some settled full-time. Laguna was not formed as an intentional colony. For example, Woodstock in New York was formed as an arts and crafts community where people would live communally. The charms of Laguna were spread by mouth, and artists began to encourage each other to visit. And newspapers began to write articles about the town. But when the Art Association was formed in 1918, and when the gallery opened, 7 full-time artists lived in Laguna Beach according to the city directory. So what makes this even more extraordinary was that the Art Association got off the ground. It was spearheaded by Edgar Payne, and when Janet gives her lecture, she'll talk all about that to you, so I'm not going to say too much about that right now. It is important to remember that the artists made up a relatively small percentage of the 150 charter members of Laguna Beach Art Association. Only 35 were artists. But this was a good indicator of how important this organization would become in the community, and not just in terms of art exhibitions, but in relation to the general welfare of the town. And new buildings were being built in Laguna. You're looking at the Laguna Beach Hotel here, an early picture of it. And again, the Laguna Beach Hotel with the Ish family. The Ish family were a very important family in Laguna Beach. What's an art association? Well, artists had long banded together to form alliances and exhibiting organizations. However, the formation of art associations was generally a new phenomenon, and it is connected to what we call the art colony movement of the late 19th century. On the East Coast, art colonies were formed in towns on what was known as the straw hat circuit. So during the summer, right, what would you wear? You would wear straw hats. This is a man's straw hat. And these were hamlets that included Old Lyme in Coscob, Connecticut, Woodstock, New York, and Provincetown, Massachusetts, all of which developed into summer art colonies during the early 20th century. Those who could afford it fled urban areas during the very long and hot summers. And although artists often decamped to Europe in the early part of the century, World War I prevented travel, making relatively local summer hamlets even more attractive for artists. Summer annuals, which were initiated and sponsored by these newly minted art associations, highlighted the work of novitiate painters and seasoned professionals alike. Art associations provided an alternative for artists to exhibit and sell their work completely outside the confines of traditional urban venues. In particular, if you showed at an unjuried summer exhibition, this was kind of a litmus test for you to determine whether you would then later include the work in larger juried urban exhibitions. So this issue of juries and standards is going to become a bone of contention in many art associations, and I'm going to discuss this in relation to the Laguna Beach Art Association in just a bit. Artists in Laguna Beach showed their work in their studios or in the local boarding house or hotel. But by creating an art association, an actual formal structure was put in place to help create what would become this very important colony in Laguna. And in the beginning of the 1920s, newspaper accounts detail thousands of people who were visiting Laguna Beach on summer weekends. So just to show you a few people who were here in the early 20th century, this is William Griffith, who eventually had a studio and a home. You're looking at his Laguna Beach 1908. Almost all the images I'm going to show you here are in the exhibition, so if you haven't had a chance to really look through the exhibition, please do so at the end of the talk. Frank Kubrian, known as the great doyen of the Art Association, and the art gallery circa 1922 to 1925. So we have art gallery registers in the archives, which identify not only the number of people who visited the gallery, but they document from where they came. And it's pretty extensive. That list includes travelers from all over the country, and basically also from different parts of the world. So the Art Association had a curator, not the way we would think of a curator today, but a person who actually helped to facilitate sales. And the LBAA got a percentage of the sales, which ranged over the years from about 15% to almost 25%. And by the mid-20s, if you had shown your work at the Art Association 6 months prior to it being sold, even if it was sold elsewhere, the association actually wanted a cut of it. And reading, as I did, the board minutes from the fledgling organization in 1918 through 1935, I was really impressed by the seriousness of purpose and the rigor with which the LBAA mounted their exhibitions. Residency requirements and dues varied according to individual art associations. So, like most East Coast art associations, originally the LBAA held exhibitions only from May through October. The most important exhibition was always held in August, September. However, by 1921, it became clear that year-round, bi-monthly exhibitions were warranted. This is the LBAA emblem, 1918, Henry de Creef, and the LBAA April-May exhibition of 1923. So one of the savvy things that the LBAA did in 1919 was to join something called the American Federation of the Arts. It was founded in 1909. And the organization curated art exhibitions that traveled to parts of the country with very limited access to museums or galleries. So, by belonging to the American Federation of the Arts, the LBAA could organize traveling exhibitions. And this is going to prove an excellent vehicle to promote the name recognition of local artists and to encourage sales for artists that are not really widely known outside of California, although the LBAA, through the American Federation of the Arts, also did travel exhibitions throughout the state. And in 1922, again, the LBAA, very savvy, opens what I'm calling a satellite gallery in Santa Ana at St. Anne's Inn. Pictures were shown in the lobby and in the dining room. So this is an excellent marketing tool, actually. And the newspaper, the Santa Ana Register, remarked that this was in accordance with the LBAA creed to create a spirit of cooperation and fellowship with the painters and the public. And the reporter also noted that these shows highlighted the bonds between dwellers in our city and dwellers in our village. So it created a community for these artists, again, outside directly of Laguna Beach in Santa Ana. The organization, I would say, was very good at what we would call today branding. And there was a tremendous outreach that the Art Association had. Artists went to local schools, they were members of community associations, and it was critical that the Art Association have a voice in how the town would develop. And they certainly tried to flex their collective muscles. In one instance, they register a protest vote regarding cutting down trees in the village, urging contractors and builders to use their thought and influence in that direction for, quote, "Without the trees, much of the beauty and the attractiveness of our village will be lost." Members of the Art Association were very keenly aware that their fortunes were tied to maintaining the inherent beauty of the town, and this needed to be a destination spot for tourists. The Art Association, it was thought, encouraged tourists who were, quote, the sort of people who were most desirable. And importantly, and really very importantly, their purchases, especially by those who lived outside of Laguna Beach, helped to raise the profile of Laguna Beach. A local real estate developer who frequented the town wrote an article warning against rapid expansion. He wrote, "You mustn't grow too fast here, or at least do not grow so rapidly that you lose sight of what you have in the way of natural beauty." So the growth of Laguna Beach was a very, very delicate balancing act, and there were a lot of competing interests. And while the Art Association needed visitors and wanted very much to have a robust community here, its members also understood that the interests of the Chamber of Commerce were not always in line, actually, with their interests. One of the challenges that was faced by the LBAA was the range of artistic competency, I'm being nice here to put it bluntly, within its membership. Some artists were nationally and internationally recognized, and many of you are going to know the names and are very familiar with them. People like William Wendt, Guy Rose, Joseph Kleitsch, another Joseph Kleitsch, Edgar Payne, Alson Clark, right? Many of the more prominent members were also members of the California Art Club, very important organization in California. But they also exhibited at the Art Institute of Chicago, the National Academy of Design, and in Los Angeles galleries such as Kanst and Cannell and Chapin and Stendhal galleries, concurrently showing their work actually at the LBAA. But for local, less successful artists, however, the LBAA was their artistic lifeline. How many of you know Alice Fullerton? Lindy, you can't play. And you can't play either. Okay. None of you, right? And a lot of you know about art in California, right? This is a pretty savvy group. I know you are. Okay. How many of you know Edith Truesdell? Anybody? No. Okay. But I'm here to tell you, Alice Fullerton exhibited at the Laguna Beach Art Association for decades, and so did Truesdell. This brings me to the issue of whose work was actually exhibited. Who made up the juries? In 1916, an art critic, his name was Everett Carroll Maxwell, wrote, "No jury was ever satisfactory to all concerned. Just as long as juries are composed of human beings, this sad state of affairs will always exist," right? Don't we know? He further noted, "If a weak work of art is hung, the institution is a fraud, and the defrauded have a right to call down judgment upon it." So that's very interesting, basically. You are what you exhibit. We know that members elected the juries. And from records, and we have extensive records, we also know who sat on those juries. But by 1921, this issue of juries and selection was very fraught. And the issue was actually taken up in the newspaper Laguna Life, which was the local newspaper. So they wrote on this in 1921. And they say, quote, "From various sources, comments, and occasionally more than comments, have come to Laguna Life upon the system of selection of pictures used by the jury of the Art Association. If these criticisms have come from those whose work has been turned down, we can understand and appreciate the feelings that prompt it, although we may not wholly sympathize with it or wish to encourage it. That such a comment, however, has come from others has occasioned our looking a bit into the matter. It must be assumed that the jury chosen by the association are capable of making, judging, and selecting justly, and it must be granted that pictures rejected are rejected through well-founded reason." So they did look into it, and they concluded that we should not envy the jury, nor must we condemn the jury. A very neutral position, fairly diplomatic, I might say. But for the purposes of anonymity, the names of the artists were covered during jury selections, although, quite frankly, with anyone with a trained eye, it wouldn't have been especially difficult to discern what work belonged to whom. This issue is going to become even more complicated with the injection of Anthony Anderson into the mix, who worked as the art critic for Laguna Life from 1921 to 1923. Now, he still was maintaining his job as art critic for the Los Angeles Times, which he held until 1926. He worked for them for over 20 years. Anderson was an artist. He had helped to form the Painters Club, which was a direct predecessor to the California Art Club, again, very influential. He probably knew more, I would say, and had written more extensively about art in California than any other critic during his long career. And he was a wordsmith. I know because I've literally read hundreds of his reviews. Sometimes he was eloquent, he was insightful, sometimes he was fawning, and sometimes he was brutally blunt and acerbic when he felt the need. And at times he felt the need to remind the Art Association that their vetting practices were lacking. So he writes, "My pleas for fewer and better pictures have not fallen on barren soil. There are artists among the Lagunae who agree with me, and I opine that someday, not too far in the distant, they're going to work with might and main for that very end. They must, for the reputation of Laguna Beach as a place of good art is at stake." He warns the jurors not to choose paintings for friendship's sake, but rather for art's sake. So let's remember, the gallery was relatively small, but exhibitions could include as many as 50 paintings. Such observations, Anderson did not ingratiate himself with the locals, and many of them knew him very well. So in March 1922, members of the Art Association penned a rebuke in Laguna Life, repudiating his comments. And they said, quote, "The association does not desire undeserved praise. Its members are earnest and sincere in their attitude towards their profession. We should all like to be Brangwins, Waas, or Sargents, John Singer Sargent, these are well-known artists. But we are trying. I might even say with some degree of success, to serve the cause of art in Southern California. If a call for picture finds the very best thing we ever did serving the public at some exhibition, then of course we have to send the next best. It is much easier to tear down than to build up, and we feel that the type of criticism indulged in must always be the best aims of both the critic and the work criticized. So the idea was also that you couldn't necessarily, if you were exhibiting at the LBAA, send everything that you wanted because probably you were exhibiting elsewhere at the same time. So also, the writer decries Anderson's suggestions that there be fewer pictures. He says, why bless you? Visitors enjoy and appreciate lots and lots of pictures that you and your condition seem to think duds. Our gallery walls would look bare indeed. We'd lose half our visitors, and from our standpoint, the half we most desire. And we'd throw such a chill upon the rest of them that our next exhibit would be a lonesome one. Now, I am not suggesting that Anderson didn't offer positive reviews. He did. But there was a fair amount of public shaming. It's a really good thing Anderson did not have an Instagram or a Twitter account. And in June 1923, Laguna Life announced that Anderson would be retiring as the art editor, but would, quote, collaborate with the new art editor whenever his aid and counsel is requested. The stated reasons for his departure that his several lines of writing were becoming burdensome. Well, okay, that might have been true. But we might speculate that his departure was less related to his full plate of responsibilities than to his rather unpalatable commentaries, which basically made the locals dyspeptic. Against the backdrop of this very heated dialogue, Arthur Miller replaces Anderson as the critic for Laguna Life in 1923. He actually replaced Anthony Anderson in 1926 as the critic for the Los Angeles Times. Again, Laguna Life, the newspaper. Quote, he has a wide acquaintance among the artists of Southern California, a sincere appreciation of their aims and ideals, and has an earnest desire to further the cause of art and to spread the knowledge of love for the beautiful in nature. Millier's first review, this is what he says, quote, not with a few tremors I embark on my first, description of a Laguna Beach Art Association exhibition. Tongues will wag as I unwittingly step on this or that artist's tender corn, so my reputation will gain or suffer in that quarter. I am blissfully ignorant of those whose support may conceivably be most important to me. Not exactly quite true. So let us turn the bull loose in the china shop, and where is China more delicate than an artist's ego? He's actually quite complimentary of the show, but he offers a shot across the bow at Frank Kuprian. Kuprian is beloved in the art community, right? So he says, quote, Kuprian has not done himself justice in his contribution, Morning Surf. It wasn't this painting, but I'm assuming it looks something like this. If it is not possible to send a good example of one's work, it would surely be advisable to remain unrepresented when one has an enviable reputation to sustain. Ouch. All right. In the larger context, this issue of standards, or lack thereof, was becoming really critically important in the discourse on American art. And members of the Art Association addressed these issues in the local paper. One artist commented, quote, it's that old medieval idea. People don't know what's best for themselves. True actors and musicians have managers, but they are only the middlemen. The public is the final arbiter. This is a wise association of New York which permits each member to exhibit one painting not passed upon by the jury. He may have been referring to the Woodstock Art Association, who occasionally did that. So this is going to beg the question, how does the Laguna Beach Art Association fit into the context of art associations in the East? And in 1923, a writer in the Los Angeles Times bestows the moniker of the Provincetown of the Pacific Coast on Laguna Beach. And the following year, he says that, quote, there was a time 2 or 3 years ago when Laguna Beach prided itself on being called the Provincetown of the Pacific Coast. Today, this quaint spot, this habitat of artists, believes it has evolved a salient and charming personality all its own and would resent any comparative appellation. And this was undoubtedly true. By the first decade of the 20th century, art associations had been established in towns like Provincetown, Massachusetts, Old Lyme, Connecticut, Greenwich, Connecticut. And this boom in the formation of art associations provided artists and the towns that they lived in a lot of important benefits. And in most cases, there was a synergetic relationship between the artists and their very small communities. But no two art associations were alike. Each had its own set of rules, each had its own set of bylaws. In some cases, you had to be a resident in order to be included in a show. The number of exhibitions per year varied. Membership requirements varied. Some exhibitions were juried, some weren't. But despite all of this, all of these different mandates, there was this connective tissue. And it was the essential roles they played in their local economies and their involvement within community activities. Because the art community was intricately woven into the fabric of the town, artists contributed to local causes. In Laguna Beach, artists provided tremendous community outreach. They taught at local schools, they sat on community boards, but this was not unique to Laguna Beach. This largesse was seen in other colonies. For example, the Provincetown Art Association gave money to the Red Cross. They helped fund a local medical clinic, and this is my favorite. They assisted with mosquito remediation in town. Now, apparently this was a really big problem in town, but presumably a really big nuisance for those painting on plein air in the outside. One of the existential issues that confronted art associations was how to deal with stylistic diversity. And what I'm talking about is this battle, basically, between the conservatives and the moderns. So, generally speaking, the ranks of early art associations were formed by more conservative artists, generally speaking. But by the 20s, art associations were grappling with the rise of the modernist movement and its impact on conservative organizations. And something groundbreaking really happens in 1913. It's a watershed. And it is the International Exhibition of Modern Art, better known as the Armory Show, and some of you may be familiar with this. So in 1913, for the first time on a large scale, modern art is shown in the United States, in New York. This show had certain supporters, but a lot of detractors, because American audiences were absolutely shocked, and horrified, I should say, with what they saw. So modernism constituted a challenge to stylistic norms and traditional subjects. And art associations just simply could not ignore the overarching themes that were diffusing the discourse around American art in the early 20th century. This is an install of the Armory Show, and those of you familiar with Brancusi, you can see Madame Pogany here that was in that show. This was also in the show. This is Marcel Duchamp's New Descending a Staircase #2. It was called An Explosion in a Shingle Factory. Critics screamed and they yelled, "Where was the nude?" They couldn't find the nude. The likes in this of Arthur Dove were also shown, Marston Hartley. Both Hartley and Dove were part of the circle of Alfred Stieglitz. Some of you may be familiar with Stieglitz, very famous photographer, but Stieglitz was a huge supporter of American modernism in the early 20th century. He had a gallery called 291. If you wanted to see modern art on a small scale before the Armory Show, you went to Stieglitz's gallery. The founders of the LBAA generally fell under the very large umbrella of what I call impressionizers. So there was diversity in the group, but none of the artists produced non-representational work. In general, the way in which art associations navigated this very thorny issue of stylistic diversity tended to vary. In 1927, one member of the Provincetown Art Association recalled that the polarization between the conservatives and the moderns had turned the city into literally an armed camp. And their solution to this was to mount separate modern and regular summer exhibitions between 1927 to 37. So you could either submit to a modern or a regular exhibition. And the annual report for 26 noted that, quote, "The differences of opinion naturally arise in the conduct of the affairs of any art association or corporation. Without them, the association is apt to lack life and vitality. I think we are to be congratulated on the spirit of toleration and respect each individual or party has shown for the opinions of the others." Basically, let's all just get along. They debated these artistic battles in forums and in discussions sponsored by the Art Association, but in 1937, they decided to hold one exhibition and divide the gallery space in half. So you could either submit to a modern or a regular jury. Okay, that was their solution. The Woodstock Art Association was formed in 1918, but they anticipated the battle lines between the groups. And written into their constitution, they write, "It is the purpose of the association to give free and equal expression to conservative and radical elements because it believes a strong difference of opinion is a sign of health and an omen of long life for the colony." The board of directors was composed of 5 members, both of the radical and the conservative group. So there were various solutions on how to deal with this. However, the LBAA did not suffer from these types of fissures in the early years because its membership was overwhelmingly conservative. By the mid-1920s, modernist works were an essential part of LBAA exhibitions. And as we will see, these artists didn't abandon the naturalistic world or the realistic world, but they interpreted in ways that really pressed at the outer edges of traditional thought and practice, but they didn't actually subvert it. Members of the modernist group of 8 included Alvarez, de Queef, Hinkle, Rich, Schuster, Schrader, and the Vesicles. And all of these artists belong to the LBAA. And they exhibited sporadically as a group throughout the 1920s, but they all exhibited individually, in some cases for many, many, many years at the Art Association. Alvarez, Rich, and Schuster were some of the earliest members, actually, of the Art Association. A watershed moment in LA was when, oh, by the way, let's just look at a couple of those. Mabel Alvarez, these beautiful paintings that are in our show, we're so fortunate. Vesicle and Donna Schuster. Stanley McNaughton Wright became the director of the Art Students League in Los Angeles in 1923. And many of his students and followers, including Conrad Buff, Helena Dunlap, and Lorza Feidelson also exhibited at the LBAA. It's important to remember that the work of the conservatives at the LBAA hung cheek by jowl next to more modernist painters in exhibitions. But in general, the juries were very conservative. But even artists such as Anna Hills, our beloved Anna Hills, accepted, the diversity. She wrote, "Don't expect all painters to paint the same variety of pictures. Some are doing it in an abstract way, but it is beauty just the same." Others were not so generous. William Wendt had a particular disdain for modernist art, writing, "The modern way of many young painters, flip wielders of the brush, who are forever striving for an effect I have no patience with." Nonetheless, the critical reception to the modernists was generally positive. And in 1926, one reviewer who looked at the show said this: "Having opened the doors to the more modern painters, the Laguna Beach Art Association has gone in for even more unusual things in the current exhibition. The walls are vibrant with color, some of it much in evidence, and that is something in a gallery which has been overly careful as to who is exhibited on its walls. The present exhibition is highly entertaining and effective." And singled out were the works of Donna Schuster, Thomas Hunt, and Annie Balda. Thomas Hunt. But particular praise was reserved for Schwankowski's modern music. The reviewer said, "The artist employed his wife as a model, and he has embodied in this picture the spirit of music as exemplified in the aura which is supposed to surround the temperament of the true musician. His wife actually was a musician. Frankly modern, painted in the light of scientific enlightenment, the painting is a study in dynamic symmetry. Whether or not the public likes this unusual picture, it will at least be enthralled." So also by the 20s, we get works by American scene painters, works by Phil Dike and Millard Sheets, for example, became familiar on the walls of LBA exhibitions. Paul Sample's Unemployment, which was actually in an LBA exhibition that we have here, was a commentary on the very harsh realities of the Depression. The nature of the exhibitions began to change. But with the onset of the Depression, not all was well with the organization. So some works continued to sell, but the economic situation extracted its toll. And pragmatically speaking, the Art Association needed to sell works. So in 1930, the LA Times critic Arthur Millier comes to Laguna for the day. And he writes an interesting article. He says he's looking for a place to eat. And he recounts the following. He says, "We inquired why the dynamic symmetrists, as opposed to the blue gum and wave painters, ate, and we were directed to the Mad Hatter, run by two charming damsels who fed us well. Here we heard the artistic reds fomenting. It seems the future of the Art Association and the gallery trembles. Some say, hang what we can sell, and others, give 'em high art and hang the sales. Still others want the local businessman to give away a painting with every pound of tomatoes." Extremely traditional artists thought the modernists were crazy. That's not my word, that's theirs. And this made for mounting tensions within the organization. So the situation basically hit critical mass in 1938. The board of directors of the LBAA proposed a compromise. They were going to float a trial balloon, as it were. And for a year, there would be an academic jury and a modern jury. And the gallery would be divided. Artists could decide to which jury they wanted to submit. So this strategy had been successfully implemented in other art associations. But the motion was scuttled by the conservatives, although it seemed like a reasonable proposal. My assumption, although I don't really have any written evidence to back this up, is that by establishing a modernist jury, I think there were fears about what sort of aberrant art might end up on the walls of the gallery. But the irony, of course, is that alienating the modernists did not really advance the association's position. After 1938, several modernist artists either completely abandoned the Art Association, others limited their participation. So we could argue the merits of this decision, but the organization did manage to carry on even through the very, very difficult years of World War II. Laguna cultivated its artistic and bohemian reputation. In the 1920s, a visitor wrote about Laguna Beach women. "The female of the species did not believe in being encumbered with too much clothing on the beach. She wears a one-piece bathing suit that exposes her anatomy to the best advantage, appears on the street, and does her shopping in a bathing suit. Oh, and the spooning on the beach." So the fact that Laguna had no Ferris wheel, no midway, no billboards, all really helped to set it apart from other beach towns. But that it had the gallery and the Art Association, well, really, that made it unique. The air in Laguna Beach was rarefied. It smelled of sea, and it smelled of salt, but it also smelled of paint, and linseed oil, and turpentine, and varnish. And that made it the beach that was different. So I thank you all for your attention. Thank you. Thank you.